Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on optimizing digital health trials by engaging patients and sites. My name is Elizabeth Earline and I'm from the National Health Council. And I'd like to welcome you. Next slide, please. This is a webinar that's hosted by the National Health Council, and the NHC is a membership organization made up of more than 140 national health-related organizations and businesses. The NHC's core membership includes the nation's leading patient organizations, and you can see their logos listed here. And our other members include other health-related associations and nonprofit organizations, as well as business and industry. So we're very excited to have many of our members joining us for today's webinar. Next slide, please. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. First, the webinar will be recorded and it will be available on our website afterwards. We'll be providing the link, but it's at the same location where you registered for today's webinar. You'll be muted throughout the duration of the presentation, but feel free to please use the Q&A function in order to submit questions, and we will have time at the end for Q&A. Next slide. So just a reminder that this is part of an ongoing series that the NHC started back in 2018, and we have covered a number of topics since we started the series back then. Here are the topics that we have, and we have a blog as well as a recording of each of the different sessions available on our website through our education platform. So feel free to check those out. And now just a little overview of our agenda for today. So I'll provide speaker introductions. Then we'll hear a brief introduction to CIDI and the Digital Health Trials Program. And then we'll move into an overview of the recommendations and resources related to engaging patients and sites in planning trials using digital health technologies. So we'll be hearing from Virginia and Cindy to cover those topics. And then finally, we'll have around 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So feel free to submit any questions during the session, but we will wait until the end to cover those. Next slide, please. So let me quickly introduce our speakers, and then I'll be turning it over to them. So Virginia Nido is joining us, and she serves as Global Head of Product Development and Industry Collaborations for Roche. And Virginia serves on the board of the Association for Clinical Research Professionals and leadership committees for Transcelerate Biopharma, as well as the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, or CIDI. And she's currently developing Roche policies and publications on bioethics of genomic research and treatments. Virginia is passionate about the power of industry collaborations to improve the efficiency and quality of clinical research. And I'm also very pleased to be joined today by Cindy Geoghegan. Cindy is a patient advocate and also principal of Patient Partners, LLC. She's a cancer survivor with decades of health policy, communications, and capacity building experience. She founded Patients and Partners in 2009, and her focus is on the need for representative patient input and education in the development and dissemination of digital health tools to ensure that rapid acceleration of their use is equitable and accessible, and that patient privacy and security issues are addressed. She co-leads the CIDI Mobile Technology Stakeholder Perceptions Project and serves on the Scientific Leadership Board of the Digital Medicine Society. So we're very excited to have both of you, Virginia and Cindy, joining us, and are very thankful. So I will turn it over to Virginia to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And hello, everyone. It's nice to be with you today virtually. So Cindy and I have worked together for a while, and we've both been involved with the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative for many years. We can go to the next slide where I'll just give a little overview. Okay, there's our disclaimer. So we can move on to the next one and the next one. I'd like to give a little overview of what the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative is. So City is a unique organization in that it is a public-private partnership that was co-founded from the Food and Drug Administration and also Duke University, but it involves all stakeholders across the clinical trials enterprise. So patient sites, vendors, sponsors, IRBs. And what I really love most about City, as we call it, is that patients and caregivers' perspectives are involved really in every aspect of every project, right from the beginning. So City has a clear remit, and that is to develop and drive adoption of practices that will increase the quality and efficiency of clinical trials. And City works on projects that are evidence-based and provide impact for all stakeholders. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So what City does is we meet frequently and form teams that work on projects that are important to the clinical trials ecosystem. Some of those are recommended by the members who sit on the steering and executive committees, and some are recommended that we work on straight from the FDA. So some of the recommendations that we've developed in prior years are around quality, patient engagement, investigators and sites, novel clinical trial designs, and ethics in human research protection. So the project that Cindy and I will be focusing on today took place over about 2016 to 2019, and that is the Digital Health Trials Project. So we looked at a number of different aspects around using mobile devices in trials, and those included developing novel endpoints, using digital health technologies, overcoming hurdles around decentralized clinical trials, and obviously there are a lot, and we're going to talk a bit about how COVID has really changed things very rapidly for decentralized trials and digital health. And then again, the project that Cindy and I worked on together was engaging sites and patients. So how do you get patient and site input when designing these types of trials that use digital health? Next slide, please. So in 2019, City issued these recommendations from our digital health trials program, which are all around gaining impact from patients and sites, or gaining input from patients and sites. So the scope of the program included traditional trials that had mobile supported endpoints and hybrid trials or fully decentralized trials. And the focus is on the use of mobile technology in FDA clinical trials. So we narrowed in the scope a bit to really look at FDA regulated clinical trials after the time of initial consent. And as I mentioned, the prior projects focused on new technology-supported clinical trial endpoints, the actual use of devices, like how do you handle devices themselves in trials for data capture, and then decentralized trials. So the whole program was called Digital Health Trials, and our program called Engaging Patients and Sites was formerly called Stakeholder Perceptions, and this was the final or fourth set of recommendations in this set. So these recommendations that we'll talk to you about show specifically where and how patients and site perspectives should be engaged in planning trials using digital technology. So in order to account for the needs of those stakeholders and to ensure the overall success of the trials. So in that sense, we did issue these recommendations last on purpose because they are kind of an umbrella for all of the other sets of recommendations, and they're cross-cutting and add important aspects or considerations to all of the other digital health trials programs. Next slide, please. So while sponsors were the primary audience for this set of recommendations, there's also important considerations highlighted for patients and patient advocates, caregivers, sites, technology providers, and IRBs. So these recommendations focus on 3 topics, and we're going to take you through these in the order shown here: engaging patient and site perspectives, maximizing value and minimizing burden for study participants, and addressing challenges for investigative sites. Next slide, please. So we had a whole lot of people working on this suite of recommendations. It was a multi-stakeholder project team. As you can see here, we had representatives, patients, caregivers, sponsors, the FDA. We had vendors, so really, cross-cutting with experts in this work. And we really want to thank the team for dedicating so much time and effort and knowledge to make this work possible. Next slide, please. So I'm going to tell you a bit about how we did this work. If you're really interested in digging in, the detailed methodology is available on the city website, but it began with scoping work that included a literature review, and then we conducted some focus groups. So city always works with very skilled social scientists to scope and conduct this research, and this project was no different. We worked with those social scientists, and then we conducted a survey of patients in 4 different therapeutic areas. And these were patients who had already participated in a clinical trial or were likely to participate in a clinical trial. They said themselves that they were likely to participate. We did not reach into patients who would never do this. We did look for patients who had experience with traditional clinical trials. We wanted to understand their preferences and concerns related to the use of digital health or mobile technology in clinical trials. We also met with 12 investigators, and we did semi-structured interviews with them who already had experience in digital health in clinical trials, fairly experienced investigators. So then we took all of that and we conducted a 1.5-day meeting with 44 stakeholders who are experts in this field, along from all different stakeholder groups. And we did panel discussions and presentations on topics such as implications of mobile technologies for traditionally underrepresented populations in clinical trials, and then for site experiences with clinical trials. So what you're going to hear about next are the recommendations that resulted from this work and more than 3 years of work and active discussions among the project team. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to turn it over to Cindy Geoghegan, and she's going to discuss our findings on patient perspectives.
Thank you, Virginia, and thank you all for having me and for participating. So I'll take you through the multi-stakeholder recommendations and then in more detail some of what you could find when you go to the city website. But first, what I'd like to say is, as Virginia mentioned, we started this in late 2015, 2016. And one of our goals was to kind of accelerate the uptake of use of mobile technologies in clinical research, and looking at some of what the potential barriers might be. And so the recommendations are focused on that, but as we'll also discuss, the uptake has really been tremendous as a result of COVID. And part of that is because it makes things easier for patients, and you'll see that patients really prefer this. I'm sorry, that's my dog barking. Okay, so I'm terribly sorry. The first recommendation is to engage patients and investigative site personnel. I'm sorry, hold on one second. I'm terribly sorry. There's somebody at the door. And anyway, engaging patients and investigative site personnel early and often in planning clinical trials using digital health technologies. And one of the things we looked at is digital technologies are not going to solve all of the issues and barriers for participants, but they can make some things easier. So what we were looking at is what's the same as compared to a traditional clinical trial and what's different. So engaging patients and investigative site personnel is important throughout any trial, as groups like the National Health Council and City has other recommendations on the importance of that. But in this case, it's especially important. Selecting the technologies based on the requirements of the study and the needs of the intended user population. So if you're working with a Parkinson's disease population, for example, you might not want something that needs like really intense dexterity. So these are the kinds of things we need to take into consideration. And identifying and conducting feasibility and pilot studies with sites and a representative patient population to address that. So not just looking at users that you might, a young population that might have used, like, for example, some consumer devices like a Fitbit. In another instance, you can't just apply it in a clinical trial. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is one of the project resources. It's pretty detailed, and then you can find this on the website. So I'll just take you through it as an outline. And some of this came from the work, as Virginia described, through some of our colleagues in the other studies throughout the digital health platform program. So selecting outcome measures that matter to patients. So just because you can measure something with a new whiz-bang tool doesn't mean that it's going to be better. So we need to measure things that are important to patients, and only if it's better than something that the way you might have measured it before. Defining the study participant characteristics. So for example, you need to look at inclusion and diversity. So if you need to do research on a population that might not have the health literacy or the digital technology kind of ability or even broadband access, you need to look at that as well. And also in selecting the mobile technologies, you got to weigh the protocol elements against the participant burden, because in some cases you're really shifting a burden and some risk to the patient or the participant and family member that might have taken place at a site. And then planning the trial logistics. This is adding a lot of steps, as Virginia will describe later as well at the site. It's simplifying, but it's different. So plans for addressing technical support needs, batteries dead, not charging, not collecting, and patient site interactions, and plans to address challenges for the sites, including budgets and contracting, infrastructure changing, training and having people available. And then developing the materials and communications. As we'll talk about later, this is a case where, participant consent materials and things describing things like data and health monitoring and privacy are important. And evaluating opportunities to return outcomes and other data and determine how best to return that to patients. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Next slide, please. So implementation questions, and all of these are screenshots of some of the materials you can find on the city website with a lot of details, checklists. The goal really was for this project was to create resources that could be used and applied to accelerate the use of digital technologies. And I think they were really helpful as people started, as a result of COVID and people being quarantined and afraid to go to the clinic, they became quite useful. So are the relevant patient perspectives being sought from the earliest stages of planning, not just in the beginning, but throughout. So what might some of the challenges for the patient group be? Protocol development needs to incorporate patient and site perspectives on the ability of all relevant populations to participate. One of the other things that COVID has brought forward is some of the disparities in care and access to care issues, and the things that technology might enable, they might also increase some of these gaps. And have protocol elements been weighed against the potential added burden on participants and sites? For example, if you're going to be tracking and monitoring somebody 24/7, it should benefit them and they should understand and recognize what that benefit is. Next slide, please. Conducting the necessary feasibility studies. And there's a little bullet on the bottom. City has actually launched a pilot of an interactive database of published feasibility studies. So nobody's asking anybody to reinvent the wheel, but to focus on information that's not available from prior feasibility studies. Like some of these devices and tools hadn't been used in clinical research before. So it's important to share the experience. And you want to ensure that the technology meets patients' needs, like the tolerability, the acceptability, the usability. This is complex, and the protocol simulation needs to detect any potential issues before launch. And piloting the trial and related technologies with Center of Excellence sites. So maybe this had been done before, but you want to look at it in places that have the capacity and the ability to do it. Many of these are new technologies to a sponsor, and that you can't underestimate the importance of that testing. Next slide, please. So maximizing the value and minimizing the burden. And here we're going to get into some of what we found and some of that fact finding that Virginia described. Next slide, please. So the informed consent process should involve an ongoing interactive conversation. We need to account for patients' health literacy and technical literacy in all communications. As Virginia mentioned, we did a survey of potential participants early on, and these were mostly technically literate people because the survey was online and it took almost an hour to conduct, and it was, the people they volunteered to take the survey. But we need to look at not everybody has that capacity. We also need to be prepared to identify and evaluate privacy risks. As we'll see in a later slide, few of the survey participants really were concerned about privacy, and we think that was because they assumed that since it was clinical research that would be taken care of. But as time evolves and breaches occur, it's something we need to think about, and patients need to understand their potential risks and weigh it against benefit. Ensure that participants understand the implications of their privacy and the confidentiality of the digital health technologies used. So it's not just what's being collected, but how it's transferred, who gets to see it as time goes on. And setting clear expectations with participants about safety monitoring during the trial. Provide participants with easy access to technical support. You'll see what patients are bringing or participants are bringing, their expectations that come from the community, the consumer technologies. Like I'm wearing an Apple Watch, I have a phone sitting here. We expect to have that kind of level of support that we get when we're using these devices as a consumer. And be mindful that digital health technologies can change the way sites and participants interact. It could be fewer visits, it could be more just downloading things. So it's kind of adding another potential barrier or a relationship into the mix. And then identifying ways to return value to the participants throughout the trial, including the return of the outcomes data collected by technology. We're talking about returning results to patients at the end of trials. But again, when you add this consumer technology where they're expected to be seeing their own data in real time, we need to talk about how we do that. Next slide, please. So the consent needs to be detailed, but it needs to be in language that people understand, and it needs to describe the technology and what it's going to collect, because we're not just talking about consumer wearables or apps. We're talking about things that might be like a patch. We even looked at ingestibles. So the person needs to understand what the technology is. The data privacy and confidentiality, unfortunately, in the world that we live in, we can't ever fully tell people that their privacy will always be protected. So there's some level of risk, and we need to be able to share that in a good way, in an understandable way, and confidentiality, who is going to see the data and when. The access and commercialization. So if my data is shared, will somebody potentially make money from that is a question that some more sophisticated participants may ask, but it's information that we should have in the consent for everybody. Data sharing with participants and providers. So again, you'll see in a slide coming up that people expect to see their data, and then they also might want to share it with their community health provider outside of the trial, and it needs to be in a way that they can understand. Safety monitoring. So I'm wearing this device on my arm. My assumption may be that somebody's looking at my data 24/7, and if I fall down, an ambulance is going to come. That's not necessarily the case, so we need to be able to share that with people. And then technical support access. So if I notice that this doesn't seem to be working, it's going to really concern me, or I'd be worried about my health, I need to be able to reach somebody to ask that question. Next slide, please. So an example, we actually had implementation questions in these resources. And here you'll see some data from our survey. Who would you most want to contact to fix the mobile technology if it stopped working? Well, you don't necessarily want to call the data monitoring or the device company and talk to a tech that doesn't really understand that you have lung cancer and you can't breathe potentially, and you're worried that it's, your respiration rate isn't right on your device. Almost 80% of people said they wanted to call the trial staff. And so it's important that we lay out these expectations, that they have a contact information person to find. They wanted the person available 24/7. If that's not going to be the case, we need to tell them. And we need people that are prepared to answer the participants' queries. Again, people that might understand the disease or the context of the trial that people are in, and not just be able to tell them they forgot to plug it in, or if you turn it off and you turn it on. It's like we need people who can support the participants when they need the support. Next slide. Returning value to participants. So this is, I touched on earlier, but if you look at the box on the right, it says not important 2%, but the way I look at that is 98% of the people expected to be able to see the data collected about them. And if we broke it down even further, more than 2/3 of them wanted it in almost real time. They also wanted it in a way that they could understand. And this goes to patient or participant expectations across all trials, but it's especially true when you're monitoring somebody 24/7 and they want to know how they're doing. So we need to think about, we all recognize that it might add some bias to not only their behaviors, but to the trial. We need to recognize that we need to have some ways to return some value to the participant. So if the real-time access to results can't be provided, what other ways do we have to return value to the participant? Next slide, please. And I'll turn it back over to Virginia.
Thanks, Cindy. Yeah, I was just thinking about that issue that you just brought up about how to return value to participants. And it's tricky, right? Because some of these studies are blinded, and if we as sponsors gave out too much information, it really has the potential to unblind the study, or as Cindy's been alluding to, cause participants to act in a different way, or respond to EPROs or different things from the sites in a different way than they normally would. So it's tricky, and we continue to work on that. There've been a couple of hybrid or completely observational studies that I've seen that return information to patients about like how enrollment is going, and how many people were assigned to one arm versus another, things like that are more like general information, or what the demographic makeup is of the study rather than actual study results. Next slide, please. So moving on to some investigator perspectives on digital health trials. So again, we talked to 12 investigators in depth. They all had experience already with doing some type of trials using digital health, and they saw advantages and disadvantages. So they all said they would be willing to participate in future digital trials, and 7 of the 12 said they believe that the future really is, or that mobile really is the future of clinical research. Like, it's coming, and I think COVID really sped that up. So a lot of us are there right now. They also thought that digital technologies can offer important advantages over traditional trials, ranging from the ability to collect data that you might not otherwise be able to in the clinic, particularly in real time. The potential for substantially better experiences for trial participants by allowing study designs that better integrate with their daily life. However, they also felt that realizing these benefits really requires the upfront planning, and you're going to hear us talk about that upfront planning aspect a lot. There are a lot of operational challenges associated with mobile technologies, including training time and time spent on troubleshooting, as well as doing the work upfront to minimize any burden on study participants. And I actually saw a separate study, which was released recently by the Society for Clinical Research Sites. I was just reading that this morning, and one of the findings they had was that among study coordinators, the number one reason that they would be reluctant to take on new digital health technologies in their trials is just lack of operational expertise. Like, their whole study flow, everything would need to change, to be able to do that. And so that remains now, a few years later than this research, still an ongoing problem. So as one of our investigators we interviewed put it, what should happen is that you can hand this device to the participants, they put it on, and like, we're good, right? But that rarely happens. And one of the things that came up a few times was, if you're a patient in a clinical trial, you are developing a relationship with the study coordinator, you're developing a relationship with the investigator, and your device breaks, who do you want to call? You want to call the study coordinator, right? But he or she doesn't necessarily have the expertise to help. So as Cindy mentioned, that IT support is really key to have that worked out up front. I think, one of the, coming back to the operational burden, I think one of the more depressing comments we got from an investigator, she said something like, mobile technologies can suck all the fun out of clinical research. So hopefully we can be moving rapidly away from that, but it does require a lot of work. This is very different than traditional trials, and it can also create sort of new roles, as I mentioned too, for clinical study staff. One thing I think is really important and we'll hit on is budgeting. Sponsors need to work very carefully through budgeting issues with sites, also training and support. So I'm going to highlight some of those recommendations related to that. So next slide, please. So first, we heard a number of times the importance of contracts that make it very clear what sites are and are not responsible for. So you see here 2 of our high-level recommendations and associated implementation questions to really examine. These encourage thinking through the budgets for technical support and other factors specifically related to mobile technologies. When sponsors are including feasibility testing or exploratory endpoints in a protocol, associated site responsibilities should be explicit, and those budgets should be included. And in general, for sponsors and sites, they may want to consider different budgeting approaches than for traditional trials. So the sort of, pay for site visit or pay for data approach may not be appropriate because there might be data streaming in all the time. And, there might be study designs that incorporate payments only for a first visit and a last in-person visit, and that wouldn't be appropriate anymore either. So when mobile technology is new to the sponsor, unexpected costs can occur. And so it's important for sites and sponsors to keep talking so that the budgets can accommodate this. Our recommendations also suggest that these unknowns can be minimized by incorporating site perspectives in study planning and then conducting appropriate feasibility and pilot testing. And that in turn can help provide sites with the information they need to prepare accurate budgets for the sponsors. Next slide, please. So appropriate infrastructure is a big one. And as I mentioned, that came up in just something I read this morning, that is a big issue during COVID and the need to run more hybrid trials. So appropriate infrastructure can include confirming that sites are well equipped with the necessary resources, such as sufficient internet speed, Wi-Fi coverage for when those devices will be used on site, video, live streaming capabilities, and then if televisits will be incorporated, such factors as compatibility of site networks with required software and hardware. And so you can imagine not only in clinical practice, but in clinical trials, how quickly sites had to get up to speed with some of these issues in order to keep their trials running during the pandemic. So ensuring site success also includes factors such as providing more devices to sites that are really good at enrolling patients. Some of our investigators said that they ran across a problem of having more patients than devices. So sponsors didn't provide enough devices for sites who were historically high enrollers. Ensuring efficient escalation processes are in place to provide sites with necessary IT support came up a lot, ideally directly through the IT service provider, and then putting those plans in place before enrollment begins. Training is also really key. What we recommended is that training modules include hands-on time with mobile technologies in the trial. So our investigators and site staff said, we want to play with the thing, like we want to wear it, we want to use it, so that then we are better able to inform our participants, how to use these devices. We also recommended that sponsors assess what do sites already know, because I'm on the sponsor side, but I know something that sites really, really hate is having to complete training on the same thing over and over again. So what do sites already know about this particular technology? And then sponsors should focus training on what's new or unique for this particular trial. Next slide, please. So all of these considerations and more are captured in 2 checklists that the project team has developed. One contains a set of questions for sponsors to ask in selecting and equipping sites for clinical trials with mobile technologies. And then there's a parallel checklist, and you can see just a small section of that here, designed to help sites ask appropriate questions about trials they are considering. So these checklists run through factors such as site training, workflows, physical and IT infrastructure. What's the patient population that this site hopes to recruit, and what are considerations that they need to look at regarding that patient population and their access to such things as Wi-Fi. Even geographic considerations to think through for trials that will take place in rural areas or even multi-regional clinical trials, local data privacy laws, if it's a global trial, and then thinking through technical support, given that patient and site languages, like the language between the site staff and the patients may be different, and also time zones. So if you have an IT support that's only available 9 to 5 Eastern time, that's not going to work for everybody. So in all, there's 6 pages of questions to ask and practical implementation examples that are available on this link shown at the bottom of the slides. The city website's pretty easy to navigate. So if you'd like to look these things up further, you can find them there. Next slide, please. So just in a few closing comments, looking across all of these recommendations, the key message that Cindy and I want to leave you with is the importance for planning for and addressing new challenges in order to maximize the benefits of digital health technologies. I'm going to say this a little bit tongue in cheek, you can't just jump right in there, but yet we did, right? We had to do that during the spring and summer, and many sponsors, sites, and CROs were quite successful actually in being able to pivot to hybrid trials. Next slide, please. So across City's digital health trials program, we noticed a wide range of potential benefits that we highlighted that can ultimately benefit all stakeholders that are participating in trials. The recommendations that we outlined today go hand in hand with the other recommendations and show how these and other benefits can be realized through effective engagement with patients and sites. Next slide, please. So why is this important for patient advocates and caregivers? So it's especially important to get representative patient input in digital trials. And I noticed there was one question in the chat regarding recommendations for visually impaired or patients with other impairments that may relate to how they use the mobile technology. And yes, our recommendations do touch on that. I don't think, Cindy, you can remind me, but I don't think we go into detail for like every type of disability, but clearly that is very important. As Cindy mentioned, if you're running a trial with Parkinson's disease, you don't want something where people are having to, press little tiny buttons, or if you're running a trial in rheumatoid arthritis, you can't have people trying to, work little straps and strap things onto their wrists. So that is definitely a key consideration. We know that digital health technology creates unique challenges as well as opportunities. We need to look at consent, data privacy, security communication. These are really important new areas for patient education and advocacy. So very much around this creating of new roles in this industry. We need to address patient expectations. Cindy touched on this a lot. We have expectations from consumer wearables and apps that our data, is flowing to us in real time, and that is not going to be the case in most clinical trials. This needs to be clearly communicated to patients and managed. Additionally, we're somewhat used to 24-hour technical support. This may not be the case for trial participants. And importantly, as Cindy mentioned, there's generally not going to be a healthcare provider on the other end monitoring these patients 24/7. We did run across some patients who said, well, if I have an AE, like my provider will know, right? Well, not necessarily, right? That's still a process that we would have to go through to collect that information from patients. So patient needs can also vary widely. Early engagement and feasibility, absolutely critical. Setting clear expectations from the start of participation, including during the informed consent process. And then ensuring access to devices, broadband, wireless, et cetera, to patients across the spectrum of who may or may not have that technology. And how do we overcome barriers such as patients who don't have access, good internet access? We still want those patients in our trials. So these are challenges that we need to work through. Next slide, please. So as we've been mentioning throughout, COVID changed a lot of things. We published this work in early 2019, and by early 2020, the world was looking pretty different. The pandemic greatly accelerated the adoption of digital devices into trials, often requiring sponsors, sites, patients, IRBs to pivot within a week from a traditional trial to one that incorporates more digital components. And we've seen success stories. This was not impossible. There are many success stories of sites and sponsors and, credit where credit is due, CROs really allowing this really quick pivoting to more hybrid type of trials. So some of the trends that we're seeing are that there are fewer patients entering trials and there's a delayed start of new trials now. There has certainly been an impact on patients currently in trials around remote monitoring, consent, telemedicine, video visits, and shipment of meds. So the FDA, the EMA, and Health Canada all issued regulatory guidance on trial conduct during COVID. You can see a link to the FDA guidance here. And all of that was really focused on patient safety. That is the primary concern of sponsors and sites, is keeping patients safe during these trials. And how did we continue to do that during COVID? So much of that documentation or guidance that the regulators put out, as well as the focus from sponsors and CROs, was on keeping patients safe. We note here that there was success in a completely digitally driven trial in the UK, which was a COVID trial called the Recovery Trial, which was done primarily completely decentralized. And then, we talked about how some of our investigators, the 12 that we interviewed, said that digital health is the future. And we're seeing now, like, the trend is irreversible. Like, how could we and why would we go back to the way things were before? I think many in the industry, in this ecosystem, are really seeing positive shifts that despite the operational challenges, we were able to do it. And why would we ever go back to paper heavy, slow, traditional trials? And obviously, the vaccine trials were a huge testament to how quickly that we can get things done when we really have to. Next slide, please. So some of the resources to support implementation, City has developed a wide range of these resources, which are available there on the website. There's planning checklists for ensuring site readiness and effective site and patient engagement during study planning. Ideas for returning value to participants, as we mentioned, how patients want to see how this trial is going, and how do you do that without breaking the blind? And then a summary set of implementation questions that will guide you and remind you after reviewing the in-depth recommendations document. So all these recommendations are available for free on the City website at the link you see here. Next slide, please. So thank you. That is it for our presentation. And I just want to extend a really special thank you to our recommendations advisory committee and all of the team that helped with this work. I think we can open it up for questions at this point, Elizabeth.
That's right. Thank you, Virginia and Cindy, so much for your presentation. I know we had a couple of questions come in. One of them had already been touched upon, but I'd be happy to, to open it up also if you had anything else that you wanted to add for that particular question as far as it goes with digital tools and thinking through whether it's vision or other potential barriers to access. I know I was laughing during the presentation. My internet actually died. And I wondered if I would actually be able to participate in the Q&A. And so perhaps if you could speak a little bit about, patient experiences, but also from the researcher perspective, any tips in terms of troubleshooting or how we can ensure really equitable access. Here I am based in Washington, D.C. and should have access to good broadband, and yet my computer just turns off during a webinar. So love any case examples or perspectives when it comes to managing those types of challenges as well.
So if I could just jump in, this is Cindy. I mean, the question that came in earlier was specific to any novel endpoints we might have had. It might be helpful just to describe the survey we did of potential participants, because what that was they were really intensely described vignettes across 4 therapeutic areas. And we were trying to put the person through an actual trial using a device or a wearable or a patch. And so it was all make believe. And but what we did get, Elizabeth, to your point, was how people can misunderstand directions or misinterpret, and things like that they might think they're using their own data. So your point is it really underscores one of our top recommendations is to get input throughout the trial, just so you can, because I mean, actually I heard at a meeting, and this wasn't a good description, but people can screw up in a lot of ways you can never expect. That's why you have to go through a feasibility study. So that's on the site side as well as the patient side, because internet does go out, and then a patient or a participant should know who they can call, because they're going to worry that somebody's going to be worried about them, right, if their connection gets lost. So that's a good question.
Yeah, I think I would just add, maybe sort of just some off the top of my head comments, maybe not specifically related to this question, but again, this research was conducted pre-pandemic, and we were thrown into a situation where, in order to keep trials going and to ensure patient safety, we had to pivot very, very quickly to telemedicine, e-PROs, e-assessments, home health visits, mobile x-rays, all sorts of things that, frankly, sponsors and sites had pretty limited experience with. Again, there were lots of success stories. Some of the things that I've noticed from some of the later research that's been done, and these are coming from groups like Transcelerate Biopharma, which is a single stakeholder group of different leading biopharma companies globally. Also the Society for Clinical Research Sites, and ACRO, which is the Association for Clinical Research Organizations. There are a lot of very complex rules around shipping drug in the United States. That was a big burden. So we even, heard of study coordinators, investigators like driving product to patients' houses, all sorts of buy your bootstraps methods. Home health visits were very difficult to organize because just of shortage of personnel. Many people in the spring were afraid. We didn't know a lot about how the virus was spread. There were not people willing to go into patients' houses, or they were being deployed for regular clinical care already rather than clinical trials. So that was very difficult to organize. Lab visits, again, very difficult to help patients figure out how to get to a lab in a safe way, or have someone come into their home to do blood draws. So, there's a lot of missed visits. We as sponsors are going to be dealing with a lot of missing data. And there is published work already from statisticians looking at, how do we recover some of this data and ensure the integrity of these trials. you know, as Cindy and I have mentioned throughout, planning is key. We didn't have that luxury during the spring and summer, but now we do again. You know, so taking all of those lessons learned, and there's a lot of really, really good work being published already on those lessons learned, you know, white papers and publications in peer-reviewed journals, preprints about how to do this. So we need to take all of that, combine it with the lessons learned from the city project so that we can move forward with really high integrity, hybrid, or even fully decentralized trials going forward.
Absolutely. And I think, as I mentioned on our prep call, that it was wonderful that this resource existed prior to the pandemic so that it could be picked up and used as a resource. I One of the questions that came in is asking for your perspective when it comes to digital health trials as they start to settle in as the standard way of doing clinical trials. Um, how will it affect the traditional way of clinical trials? So I know, Virginia, you were mentioning that there's sort of these three different ways of thinking about trials, whether it's fully decentralized, whether it's a hybrid or whether it's more of a traditional kind of approach. From your perspective, how are you starting to see things shaping out for planning perhaps 2022 or so, when we could be thinking beyond the pandemic, in terms of interest from the industry perspective also, in planning those different types of trials?
Yeah, maybe I'll take a brief stab at that, and then Cindy, would love to hear your comments also. So, you know, I think, not to repeat myself, but nobody wants to go back to the old way, right? Like, we are seeing that remote monitoring works, that remote visits work. That being said, I think fully decentralized trials are a little ways off. I don't think that the majority of randomized controlled clinical trials will get to a point in the near to mid future of being 100% like you never see a study coordinator or an investigator. I think more visits can be remote, and certainly study teams are planning that into trials. I know that the average distance a trial participant lives from a clinical site is 25 miles. So the more that it can be worked into trial plans to minimize that travel time, yeah, you know, we're definitely working on that. But again, fully decentralized, because of some of the difficulties of drug shipment and assessments for, you know, serious diseases that need to be performed on site. I work for Genentech and Roche. We're primarily an oncology company. You can't do infusions in someone's home, right? So those infusions still need to take place at a clinic, and many of the assessments will take place there. So I see a great shift toward hybrid trials and more remote visits and more telehealth visits, reporting of adverse events on a more regular basis through telehealth visits. But a full shift, I still think, is a long ways off, you know, kind of, if ever, unless we really change the paradigm of how we're, you know, doing our CTs.
So from a patient perspective, I agree with Virginia on the fully virtual trial, although I think we may see some, just to keep pointing back to the data that we collected, was in the beginning of the survey, we asked these potential participants, we described a traditional trial with the usual number of visits, and then the mobile or the digital trial. Overwhelmingly, people chose to participate in the digital trial, even before they knew what it was going to look like. I think the convenience part and just getting researchers and investigators out of the mode that everything needs to be collected in person. I think COVID has demonstrated that. I think in one of the citations that Virginia gave, we can't go back. And I think patients and participants are going to demand more convenience and fewer visits. If something can be collected, not necessarily just by a digital tool, but if I could go to a local lab to get a blood draw, rather than in oncology, a lot of patients drive hours, if not fly hours, which they can't do now. But I think we're going to see more visit replacements for things that we can collect remotely. And we can collect things that we couldn't collect before, just like motion, activity, things like that. So I see a bright future really broadly. So I wouldn't pick a specific thing, but the convenience part as regards the patient is really going to come through.
Yeah, if I could just maybe build on that for just a minute regarding increasing the representation of underrepresented populations in clinical trials and how that relates to the use of digital health technology. So, as all of you know, and as our survey showed, the people who volunteered for that survey were typical clinical trial participants. They were largely white, largely older, largely more affluent. Also people likely to have great experience with technology and the ability to get it and use it with internet service. I am really seeing a real push, finally, like real action from sponsors to include underrepresented patients in trials. Like, it's been a long time, but I really am seeing actual efforts in that area. So, and during COVID, right? Like, we knew that the disease, the virus was disproportionately impacting people of color, and sponsors responded with trials that enrolled people of color in vaccine trials and treatment trials. So we were able to do that. However, bit of a double-edged sword, because some of those populations that we're trying to enroll may also be those populations who don't have great access to technology, who don't have great internet and Wi-Fi services. So, these are things that are challenges that will need to be worked through. Also, engaging patients in rural populations or areas can be challenging. But, as Cindy said, like, we've been forced to work through some of these issues very, very quickly. And so I am also quite hopeful that, again, we take these lessons learned and drive them forward into much higher quality and, frankly, faster clinical trials. Like, we did it with the vaccine trials. I'm really hoping that, where we can speed up the planning, not the safety, not the assessments, but the planning piece and the regulatory piece, I do see a lot of hope there.
Great. Well, thank you, Virginia, and thank you, Cindy. I think that's a good place for us to end. We do have a link to the report as well as the corresponding peer-reviewed publication accessible via our website. And of course, the city links were listed as well. But I'd really like to thank Virginia and Cindy for presenting today. We really appreciate your time. And thank you everyone who joined us. If you're interested in joining future webinars, join our mailing list and you'll receive information about it. So thank you, Virginia and Cindy, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was really nice to speak with all of you.
Yes, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, bye-bye.